The Crimson Isle is home to some of the most insane money-making methods in the entire game, where players can earn millions of coins per hour grinding Kudra, killing mini-bosses, and fishing for hours and hours at a time for a funny iron golem until they hit absolute insanity. However, the major problem with all of these methods is that they all require a ton of endgame gear to do, which as we all know is stupidly expensive. So instead, I managed to find a money-making method that even early game players can do right now to earn ridiculous money. And the funny thing is, the mob that we're going to be killing to do this has actually been behind me this entire time. This mob is the cinderbat, one of the most elusive creatures in the game that has been flying around the Crimson Isle ever since its inception in 2022. Now, if you've never even heard of this mob even existing, then don't be surprised. Most people don't know these little guys existed, and the wiki doesn't help much either by only vaguely highlighting that it randomly flies around the area. So you might be wondering why are these guys even relevant in the first place if they are hiding like me after my parents see my exam results. But don't worry, I'll come back on how to find these guys later. The more important part is that these cinderbats have a 1% chance to drop the flames item. And it's this very item that makes this moneymaker so OP, especially for beginner players. That's because you can use 16 of these flames in conjunction with a plasma bucket and some other items to craft the ever burning flame. This is mainly used to speed up combat minions permanently by 40% and can be sold for over 70 million coins each. And that's just on average. Over the past week, they have been increasing to 75 and even up to 78 million coins each, which just shows that this method is not only getting better every day, but is also very stable, which is really important for a good money making method. So now we've covered what cinderbats are, now let's talk about the real stuff, like the gear that we'll be using. If you're early to mid game, I would highly recommend using shadow goggles, 2 force dominance 3 aurora and tarantula boots. Oh, and don't forget to slap on some wisdom 5 and 5-star in the entire set, including the aurora, as well as using 4 lots of necromancer brooches to have the most cost effective way of getting as much intelligence as possible. This armor set might look incredibly weird, and frankly it is, but I'll explain why I chose all of these specific things and the total cost later on. Next, let's take a look at what weapons we'll be using. So there are actually quite a few different obscure weapons we'll need in order to be able to kill these cinderbats on the budget. The first of which being a voodoo doll, which has a pretty unique crafting recipe? Anyway, other weapons you'll also need is a Runan's bow and an aurora staff. And yes, this might be the first and only time that the aurora staff actually has a good use. On top of all this, you'll also need to buy a level 100 mythic guardian pet with the textbook pet item on it. I know this pet is really expensive compared to the other items, but trust me, this method relies on the guardian, so you do need it. Now with all of these fancy weapons, you should reforge your aurora staff to heroic and reforge your Runan's bow to neat to get as much intelligence as possible. As well as this, put 2 fine sapphire gemstones right onto the aurora staff to get that sweet plus 22 intel bonus. The reason why we aren't reforging our voodoo doll is because, well, we can. Hypixel just hates the voodoo doll, I guess. So make sure to enchant the aurora staff and Runan's bow with all of the stuff that you normally would, but just make sure you have looting 4 so we can get as many flames as possible. Last but not least, set your talismans to decisive power and check that your tuning points are in intelligence obviously. Since this is sort of a budget guide, I assume that you may not have that many talismans, and the problem with other guides is that they just assume that you have thousands of magical power. So instead, I used the wiki's formula for power bonuses, and I'm guessing that for an early to mid game player like you and I, we would realistically have around 400 magical power. If you have more than that, then great, this method is even more OP. I personally went for 420 MP because funny number equals like and subscribe, right? Anyway. Since I don't want to bore you with math, basically if you have 400 magical power and plug it into this formula, it will give you an extra 544 intelligence. Finally, to end off our setup, we'll also need some equipment. The only problem is that most equipment is pretty expensive to be any good, so instead there's actually only 2 pieces I would recommend, and those being the Rift Necklace and a Glowstone Gauntlet. The Rift Necklace is free from the Rift and gets buffed as you complete it. Since mine is 4 out of 8 time charms, I would say it's pretty fair to use for the purpose of this guide. And for the Glowstone Gauntlet, just literally buy the cheapest one that you can. If you have more coins, then you obviously want to buy Mana Pool, but it's not totally necessary if you're on a tight budget. The rest of the slots can have anything that you have lying around or buy after earning some coins. One final thing I would suggest buying before we move on though is a pocket espresso machine, as this gives you an extra 100 intel during combat, but make sure to buy some soul flow as otherwise it won't work. With that out the way, let's finally discuss how we're going to be killing these cinderbats. A majority of them spawn down in the underground part of the Crimson Isle, and you should be able to notice them pretty easily by their fiery aura. Once you've found one, you simply use your voodoo doll to attack it and then hold out and use your aurora staff. The reason we are doing this is because the aurora staff gives us a bonus 372 intelligence when held, and more importantly, allows us to use looting since we can enchant the voodoo doll. This is really important for the guardian pet as it deals 120 times our intelligence as damage. This along with the voodoo doll's tick DPS allows us to kill the cinderbat in one cycle when done properly, meaning you won't have to attack the bat twice. This is why we're putting necrotic across our whole set instead of having loving on our chestplate, because the guardian pet only cares about intelligence and doesn't get affected by ability damage. It's also why I chose to use 5 stars on the aurora pieces, because using this graph for the cost of each star shows that 5 stars is the cheapest option to get a little bit of extra mana. But actually the most optimal number is to get 7 stars, but I personally used 5 stars because just having 2 random pink stars on the aurora looks a little bit ugly in my opinion. So, if killing cinderbats just needs the aurora staff, doll and guardian, then what's the point in the tarantula boots and Runan's bow? Well, unfortunately the voodoo doll sometimes just ain't dolling, causing it to completely miss even when finding its target. The problem with this is that the voodoo doll has a 5-second cooldown which can cause a lot of downtime. So instead, we just quickly fire the Runan's bow, which has 2 homing arrows which can proc the guardian's ability and deal a ton of damage. Oftentimes you'll also find cinderbats flying around really high, making it difficult for the guardian pet to dish out its DPS due to its limited range. This is where the tarantula boots come in clutch. With these, you can simply just shift double jump around the bat, not only making it easier for your guardian pet, but also helps you use your voodoo doll and Runan's bow. If you want, you can also replace the tarot boots with spider boots, but make sure you're getting a lot of intel. Speaking of which, if you're really struggling for intelligence, you can buy a refined bottle of Jaya which gives you plus 300 for an hour as well as plus 1 intel permanently. But you shouldn't need this at all because you get way more than enough intelligence with this set. So, we've now covered what cinderbats are, what gear we need, and the basics on how to kill them. So let's discuss now the most optimal way to find these cinderbats to get what we're all here for, and that's being that sweet cash. As I said earlier, most of the cinderbats spawn in the underground chambers of the Isle. Again, since the wiki is very vague, I'm not too sure on the exact number of cinderbats that spawn, but it seems to be between 3 to 5 bats in each lobby from my experience. But to ensure that all of these guys spawn in the underground where we want them to be, I would check all the different corridors in the stronghold area near spawn, because these bats occasionally sneak away and hide, especially in an old lobby. Now, if all of the cinderbats are right where we want them to be, it is finally time to make the most efficient route possible to make as many coins as we can using our budget setup. As you can see on screen, there are 4 main waypoints where cinderbats can spawn, and you can easily place these down using sky tools. These coordinates, which I'm showing on screen now, are from Outcrow's video on this topic from a year ago, so thank you to him, as otherwise it would take me a very long time to find these coordinates myself. As you can see, I've appropriately named each waypoint as 1, 2, 3 and 4, and as you can guess, the route is fairly simple. Once you enter the underground from spawn, you want to check for cinderbats around the area near 1, then TP over to waypoint 2, which only needs a quick check. Then quickly go over to 3, which has high ceilings, making the tower boots really useful. After that, you want to go to 4 from the back to make it easy to spot any of the bats that might be hiding from their extermination. After you purged all of the bats, you want to exit waypoint 4 via the front, but instead of going straight back to 1, you're actually going to go back and check waypoint 3 before then returning to 1 and repeating the route. The reason we are checking waypoint 3 twice per cycle is because it's the most common area for cinderbats to spawn in, meaning that you'll be spending more time actually killing the cinderbats than trying to look for them. In contrast, waypoint 2 seems to be a lot less likely to spawn bats, which is why we only check it once briefly per cycle, but I have seen them in there a few times before. With that out of the way, I'm gonna play a little time lapse in the background of me grinding some flames. Whilst we wait on that though, let's talk about the real deal, about the amount of coins you can make, the total cost of the set, and anything else you need to know in order to master this money making method. First, let's start off with arguably the most important part, which is obviously the amount of money you can make. Near the beginning of the video, I showed that on average each ever burning flame sells for over 70 million coins each. However, the amount of profit that you actually get is closer to 54 million. And this is because on average the other raw materials, including the plasma bucket, enchanted red sand cubes and enchanted sulfur cubes, add up to 16 million coins in terms of cost. This effectively means if we divide 54 million by 16, that essentially gives us a value of 3,375,000 coins per flame that we drop. and after recording a few 10-minute tests, I found that on average I was killing 31 cinderbats in 10 minutes, which equates to 186 kills per hour. Now kills are obviously one thing, but how many flames does this number actually correlate to? Well, each flame has a 1% probability to drop on its own, but since we're holding out our Aurora staff with looting 4, this increases our odds by a whole 60%. Then, if you multiply this chance by your magic find, which for me is 144, then your final chance to drop a flame is approximately 3.904% per kill. This multiplied by our 186 kills means we get 7.26 flames per hour on average. Now since we need 16 of these bad boys, we can simply divide 16 by 7.26, meaning it will take us 2.2 hours to create each ever burning flame. Now, since we make 54 million coins profit per craft, we could divide 54 by 2.2 to get an average of 24,540,000 coins every single hour. Personally, I think this is incredibly good, especially if we factor in the cost of this setup. On screen I'm going to show all of the math used to make up the total cost of this budget setup, but in short our total cost is 47 million coins. Now this compared to some of my other budget guides is more on the expensive side of things, but I do feel it is definitely justified for getting 24 to 25 million an hour. I mean, that's literally comparable to late game mining, which requires billions of coins for a good setup. Whilst with this, you can pay off your whole setup with just one ever burning flame, and it doesn't even have super high entry requirements. Speaking of which, I just got enough flames from the time lapse to make another one yet again. Now with all money making methods there are pros and cons, and this method in particular has 3 flaws, but these can easily be counteracted and even be used as pros if you use them correctly. The first of which is that it sometimes can take a long time for each ever burning flame to sell. Now obviously this might be a major concern as this could mean the method is unreliable, however I actually think it's quite the opposite. First of all, this item is not useless, it is the best permanent fuel in the game, meaning that end game players are the most likely customers for these. Also, you only get an ever burning flame on average every 2.2 hours, meaning that the market will rarely be flooded with a ton of these, which increases your odds that it sells. The best bit of advice I can give you is do not panic sell and just be patient. It might be worth setting the auction timer for longer if you have multiple ever burning flames to sell. Now, the second flaw is that you do need Red Sand Collection 10 in order to start crafting these. In my opinion, this might be the biggest obstacle stopping people from doing this method, and that's not because it's hard but because it's just so boring. Thankfully it doesn't take super long to get 100k red sand, at most it will maybe take about 3 hours of a cheap setup and at least you'll get a few million coins out of it. But hey, if you manage to get that collection, you're already doing better than 90% of the people watching this video. So, the final quote-unquote flaw is that this method is obviously RNG dependent, meaning you can easily go for hours with only getting a few flames if any. But equally speaking, you could also get like 3 flames in a row and make a ton of profit. Plus, I think it's also really satisfying just hearing the magic find sound effect when you get a rare drop. Speaking of which, increasing your magic find is a really good way to increase the amount of flames you can get. And if you want to know how to get a lot of magic find, then I would recommend watching my video on how to get a ton of it if you're a beginner or even a late game player. Regardless of my shameless plugging, I now fully believe you are ready to conquer cinderbat grinding. Like I said, this method is not only insane early game, but can even become, dare I say it, one of the best money making methods in the entire game if you have a ton of coins and can afford a hype range setup. For example, I used my max setup and was consistently earning 45 mil per hour, which is absolutely unhinged. This shows that this method has a ton of potential, so if you guys have any other ideas how to make this method even more efficient, then feel free to comment them down below. But with all that said and done, I feel like I can go hibernate once again. Now although it might take a while, I will eventually see you guys in the next video. Bye bye for now and best of luck cinderbat grinding. Peace.